Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel and a slightly new filming setup. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm still figuring out the lighting situation. I feel like it's too dark on this side. Don't know how I'm going to fix that. It wasn't when I set it up. Is that better? This side's the side with the window, so obviously I'm a little bit subject to variation. Anyway, aside from experimenting with filming and lighting setups now that I've rearranged my filming space, what I want to talk about today is one of the things which I had planned to achieve this year. So I am ticking something off my 2021 to-do list. The goal that I set for myself was to write up a new and robust plan for my historical vampire story. For those of you who haven't heard of me speak of this before, it is a story which I started in 1999 and still love and still want to write, but just haven't managed to get done. So 2 years ago I basically had a bit of a freak out with how the story was going and frustrations I was having with getting critiques on it, and I decided to just put it on ice and focus on my Camino story, which was considerably closer to completion at the time, and I felt that this would give me a bit of a break from the vampire story and would allow me to finish something before returning to this much more complicated and very challenging story that I had created for myself over the space of 20 years. Sorry if you can hear laughing, my neighbours are enjoying some law-breakery. I had been working on the story and working on it and working on it and reworking it with an idea in my head but nothing written down in the way of a plan. And I think that was sort of propagating the unending rewriting, panicking, don't know what's going on situation. So I decided at the beginning of this year that I would benefit from actually planning out the story. There's a couple of extra things going on there, which I may or may not get to at the end of this video. When we first went into lockdown last year, I turned one of my sketchbooks into a planning book. So in here I have a mind map for every single one of the stories that I intend to write. Some of these are like a vague premise and that's it. One of them's like, here is the possible title of the book in one sentence and that's it. Others are masses of extra bits of paper all taped in with individual mind maps for every character and you know, lists of specific scenes and breakdowns and story beats and all of the things. So in here, obviously, is my vampire story. It's the green tab. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to pick this up, but all the, oh yes you can, all the little green edged pages are subplots for that same story. So just, you know, you can kind of get a visual idea of the fact that it's big, which is one of the other reasons why it's taken me so long. So in my attempt to make a plan for this story, I've got a second sketchbook. This one actually was already being used for biological drawings, but I'm not using these anymore, so I thought, oh well, I'll just use the end of the sketchbook. So I haven't like committed to throwing these out even though they're not finished. And then I have mind map. So what I've done, yes I'm going to blur this out, but basically what I've done is I've got the main plot for the main character covering what I know of their story. I thought this would be a good place to start because I have actually written one entire book of this series, but I had a lot of problems with it, which I will go into detail with in a minute. So in replanning out the story, I decided to put down the structure of that main character's story. So I have like here I have origin story, and then I have a couple of bullet points underneath the origin story, and then I have, like, you know, not a spoiler, main character gets made into a vampire, and then I've got that broken down into a couple of bullet points. Then what I've done, instead of just leaving it here, I've taken each of those points, like the origin story, the being turned into a vampire, that kind of thing. Each one of those gets its own mind map, and I have taken each bullet point into a subheading and given that one bullet points as well. So I've kind of broken down the breakdown of each section of the story. So that was what I'm currently kind of working on and thinking about. My thought with this is that my main character does a lot of things that to my main character seem inconsequential, but have major consequences on a bigger time scale than the character is aware of. So for example, this isn't from the story, this is just like a made up scenario. Let's say my main character, wandering through a city at night, sees a man leave a brothel and thinks, oh yes, tasty snack, and vampire bites him and he dies. Then the main character leaves the city in the dead of night and carries on with their journey, never again thinking about that random person they killed that one time, because they kill and eat many people, who cares. What the main character would never know is that maybe that guy was actually the prince, and the next day the people find the prince dead in the street and they think he's been assassinated and they start war with the neighbouring kingdom. That kind of big scale consequences for something very minor that this character has done, but the main character never realises that that was their fault. So my plan was to have the main character telling their story in first person, and then to have sort of little breakaways in third person where I showed the consequences of the main character's actions. What this created was apparently a little bit more confusing than what I had hoped. But much more importantly, in terms of planning, it meant that I created something that has all these little offshoots. So for this sort of series of mind maps that I've been making, I'm just trying to stick with everything that my main character has to do for their story, and then I'm just making little notes about the places or times where their actions have one of these bigger world consequences. So that's the beginning of the re-planning of the story that I had set out to do. Over the years in which I've been working on my vampire story, I've had two separate critique groups, and those groups have seen two different stories. So what basically happened was that I started writing the book that I intended to write and brought that to my first critique group, and then over time I realised that I had to write a different book, and I brought that different book to the second critique group. So even though I've been working on one story, I've had two separate books going to two separate groups at obviously two different times, and what I've decided to do as part of this sort of revisit and replanning process is to revisit the critiques that I got on those two books and really analyse some of the common problems that came up and think about what I need to do to fix them or prevent those problems continuing, which is of course fixing it. I don't know why I said that. So what I've done is write down the basic common critiques that I was getting and try and articulate to myself what the problem was, and then break it down into like not just what someone said but what they were meaning, or what the consequences for the story were, and try to get to the root cause of the problem, and then write down a list of potential solutions and how I felt about them. So I want to go through this because I think A, content, but B, I think really critically analysing your critiques is a helpful process, particularly if those critiques are challenging in some way. Starting with my first critique group. This was a critique group that I met at university, so obviously everyone there had higher education, and everyone had also taken the same creative writing classes at that university. These were classes which had an emphasis on poetry, emotion, and just generally beautiful writing. My group got together at least once, if not twice a week, and we would bring 3 to 4 pages of whatever we had been working on. You would give everyone a copy, and then you would read your work out loud, and people would read along with you and make additional comments on the pages, pass them back to you, and then they would also discuss the piece, and then obviously you'd move on to the next person. Through this process, a couple of kind of big issues with my story and the way I was telling it kept coming up. The first of these was the fact that I had made such an ignorant character, the narrator, and had decided not to supplement the character's knowledge in the narration. So that's what's normally seen, this supplementing of an ignorant character's knowledge. So for example, in The Mammoth Hunters, the main character is being taught how to create white leather, and she's told to collect some urine and let it sit for a few days before using it to treat her leather. And then the narrator says what they couldn't have known was that the bacteria in the urine convert the urea to ammonia, and that ammonia is a bleach which strips the colour out of the leather. I didn't want to do that in my story. I wanted to keep it so that the reader's knowledge of the world was only ever going to match the narrator's experience. I even at one point considered having maps. So I was going to break the story up into parts, and at the beginning of each part there would be a 2-page spread, and the first one would just start off with a little tiny little bit of a map coloured in with the house that she lived in, like the road, and well, not properly a road, the trail to the neighbour's house, and that's it. And then later there'd be another, like part 2, big 2-page spread, and it would have that same little drawing, but now there's like a path going further and a little bit of a coastline. And then the third part there would be more coastline going up this way, and by the end of the story it would be a full 2-page spread map of the world. That was such a unusual, interesting thing to me, and I really wanted to explore that and incorporate it into my story. It turned out though to be a much more confusing way of telling a story than I had anticipated. When I read a story and I come up against something that hasn't been well explained or an obvious gap in a story, I always assume that the writer will tell me later. And whilst noticing that gap, I might maybe guess what's going to come up next, but I remember that it's just my guess. So when that information is revealed, I'm either satisfied because I guessed correctly, aren't I smart, or I'm satisfied because I get a nice surprise and I get to rethink the bits of evidence that I came across and figure out what happened and how I missed it. And either way, I find that an enjoyable experience. But what I noticed with the people critiquing my work is that they weren't doing that same thing of noticing an error, not an error, a gap, and just sort of reserving that gap to be filled later, or anticipating things but being aware that it was their anticipation and imaginings. What was happening was that people were filling that gap and being certain that they were 100% right, and then forgetting that they had made it up in the first place. So obviously this created confusion when things were revealed. What ended up happening, and this is my first like, oh my god, horrible thing that happened, was that halfway through the book, my critique partners discovered that the main character wasn't white. I had thought that this was evident because I had told them that she had dark hair, dark skin and dark eyes, and that everyone in her family did. And I had a scene where she meets someone who is blonde and has blue eyes and she's really surprised. But that wasn't enough. The group had still managed to believe that she was white. And I think what happened there was because the narrator had never said, "I'm a black woman," she wasn't. Now, the reason she had never specified her ethnicity was partly because her ethnicity was fictional. So stating that, "Oh, I am a Citroen woman," doesn't tell you anything. And because everyone had those similar hair, skin and eye colours, she wouldn't consider those to be information carrying descriptors. So for example, I have a friend from Malaysia who talks about how when she grew up, everyone around her had, the same dark hair, the same dark eyes and fairly similar skin tones. So to her, hair, skin and eye colour is not an information carrying thing. It doesn't tell you what a person looks like. So growing up, she would pay attention to things like a person's height and the shape of their face. That's how you recognised somebody. And even though she now lives in New Zealand and she encounters lots of people who have obviously variations in hair, skin and eye colour, because most of her life has been spent where that information wasn't important, she still doesn't notice it. And so people will say to her, "Oh, so-and-so, the redhead guy," and she'll be like, "Oh God, someone has red hair?" because she just doesn't store that information. Similarly, my main character doesn't pay attention to skin, hair or eye colour as ways of recognising people because those features are relatively consistent within her population, at least at the beginning of her life. So this meant that she could never say that she was black because she doesn't consider that a descriptor of herself. I'm not sure if I'm communicating this really effectively, but at any rate, I found myself in a situation where my critique partners had imagined my main character was white and she isn't. So obviously this was something where I was like, I'm gonna have to get some feedback here because I had said, dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes, and I can't outright tell you that she is a black woman, so how do I fix it? Now, the first piece of advice that I got was, don't worry about it. People, in a very dismissive, kind of judging me slightly manner, would say, "Doesn't matter. Those people were always white." And the thing is, representation does matter. Even if it never mattered in any way, shape or form in the context of the plot, my characters are ethnically diverse and I want you to be consciously aware of it because diversity! And that should be enough of an explanation, in my opinion. I could also add in that, of course, if you are travelling the world and encountering people from various ethnicities, yes, that becomes relevant to the plot, and what your origin is going to matter slightly because that's going to affect what is or is not familiar to you as you travel. I also had a critique partner who felt that the reason my character read as a white person was because of the way that she spoke, and his suggestion was that instead of having her voice be correct English, I needed to make her speak ghetto, which is obviously super racist and unacceptable, and I did call him out on that. And the response I got was basically like, well, yeah, it's unfair, but it's still true. So that was the degree of feedback that I got in terms of how I could try and fix this identity issue. So I've decided to disregard both those pieces of advice. I do not believe that it is appropriate to make my character speak in a certain way in order to inform you as to what she looks like, because the way that you speak and the way that you look are not actually related. So I wasn't going to take that piece of advice. And the advice that I could just ignore it because it doesn't matter, obviously I'm not going to take that either because it does matter. My first solution going forward was to remove all accents and dialects from the other characters. What I had done in writing the story was make my character and the people from her area speak kind of normally or without an accent, and then everyone that she meets when she travels does have a dialect or an accent written into the way that they speak. And I did this because you are not consciously aware of your accent, you're aware of other people's. So of course she has an accent, she's not speaking English correctly, she just isn't aware of her weird sort of linguistic eccentricities and is aware of other people's, so those were the ones that I wrote into the story. However, in thinking about this issue, I obviously did a bit of reading and I came to realise that in writing in accents and dialects, it's really easy to cross the line from general description into a place of racism due to an embracing of offensive stereotyping. And obviously I didn't want to do that, so I decided to remove all accents and dialects and have everyone speak, you know, clear, proper English in the story, and then just have, you know, references into the fact that, oh, he replied in his language, or something like that. Those little indicators that a person isn't speaking English or is speaking but with a heavy accent without actually writing the accent into the dialogue. I'm hoping that by doing this I'm not only preventing stereotyping and accidentally causing an offence, etc. in the other characters, but I'm also making it clear that the fact that my main character does speak English correctly isn't an indicator of her ethnicity or background, education, etc., because everyone talks the same. My second fix for addressing this incorrect ethnicity issue was to revisit my world building, particularly as it related to the culture in which my main character had grown up in. I hadn't included very much information on this in the story because at the beginning of her story it doesn't matter, and I knew that in the future it would, but obviously that was the future and future me could deal with it. So instead of just continuing to leave it to future me, I decided to really hammer it out. So I looked not just at the situation the character was in at the beginning of the book, but where I wanted her to be at the end and what things needed to happen in her own country to get me where I needed to go. And then I traced it back. So I looked at my goal, traced back to the beginning, and made changes in the world building and description and the setting at the beginning of the story to make sure that it would be consistent and relevant to the end of the story where the culture of the main character is more relevant. And then I went further than that and thought back to, okay, well, if I need my starting point to be this, what needs to have happened historically in order for my character to grow up in this setting? And so I traced back several thousand years prior to my character's birth. So I actually ended up building several thousand years of this region's history and culture. I wrote legends, I created gods. I went from almost a completely absent culture to a very developed culture around this character. And I'm hoping that by providing a cultural context in which she is existing, I can also kind of encourage people to step away from a sort of white assumption. So no particular aspect of culture is like indicative of skin tone, but I'm hoping that by having the culture that she grows up in not be recognisably British, and you know, being something unique and interesting, that will kind of make it easier to imagine her as being a different ethnicity, even though a fictional one. I'm hoping that's how that will kind of work out. Another way in which the ignorant narrator created issues with the critique partners kind of making up stuff or misinterpreting things which the narrator couldn't explain well was that my critique partners imagined werewolves where there were no werewolves. So in my vampire story, werewolves are not a thing. They do not exist in any way, shape or form. But my main character does have a brief encounter with a monster type thing that I created. So this is an original monster, which means I have to describe it in a way that helps my reader know what it is, and I have to give it a name and all those kinds of things. But my main character has never seen it before, has a very brief encounter with it, so it doesn't give a particularly robust description, which meant that my reader, I had hoped, would just not know what it was and then later would figure it out. But unfortunately what my critique partners were doing were just deciding that it was a werewolf. And this really shocked me because I hadn't said it was a full moon, I hadn't said that it was furry or that it was dog-like or wolf-like or had, you know, like big ears, I hadn't said it had a tail, I hadn't actually said anything that would suggest werewolves. I hadn't said anything that would suggest werewolves to me. But I think because I had a creature of any kind, but an unspecified creature attacking a vampire, that was enough to tell people it's a werewolf, just because of like genre assumptions rather than anything that was actually present in the story. And because my main character didn't have an understanding of what this creature was, she couldn't tell the reader in her narration. This one is a tricky one to try and fix. And I have ummed and ahed and gone back and forth and thought about a whole bunch of different ways I could try and get the information across. And finally I came to a reluctant decision that the book I had already written and was getting feedback on could not be book 1. It had to be book 2, and book 1 had to have a narrator who wasn't as ignorant as the narrator of book 2 and was able to give a precise description of this original monster and name it and provide all of those little bits of information that would allow the reader to understand that it wasn't a werewolf even though it attacked a vampire that one time. The next issue that I had with the way I had written the story was the fact that it has a lot of time jumps in it. Now, part of the reason for this is because I wanted to show the consequences of the main character's actions. The main character might do something super minor and carry on with their life and never think about that thing again, but that action might actually have really big long-running consequences. So just sort of a make-believe example, because I don't want spoilers. Let's say my main character was in a city at night and saw a man come out of a brothel and decided to bite him. So she vampire bites him, kills him, and then just carries on with her life, leaves the city in the dead of night and never thinks about that one particular victim ever again because of course she has many. I would then have a third-person chapter, possibly in the future, showing that actually that person she killed was the prince and that the people found the prince murdered in the street the next day and this triggered a massive war with the neighbouring kingdom because they thought they had assassinated him, or something like that. So I had this jumping around thing happening where I had first person perspective and then these little sort of side stories in third person. But those side stories might be significantly different time periods as well. And I also had flashbacks to the character's childhood to explain some of her backstory, just because I hadn't wanted to start off with, you know, like day one of her life. I had wanted to start it a little bit further into the action as we usually do. This made for a timeline that jumped around all over the place. And that was something that I got quite negative feedback on. So something I had done in my first draft was put subheadings at the beginning of each chapter showing you exactly when it was in the time stream so that you would know if it was a different time period than the previous chapter. Initially I had used the format X number of years before present. I did this because I wasn't fully committed to using AD and BC because I find those slightly annoying anyway, but also because at different times of writing the story, discovery writer problem, I wasn't 100% sure if I was keeping it to Earth with maybe a few fictional elements, or if I was going to push into alternative Earth or go even further into completely fictitious, not Earth at all world. I was kind of figuring it out. And if it was a fictional world, then I didn't want BC and AD. That just didn't feel right to me. And I liked the idea of using just before present, so it was just like saying X number of years ago, but it gave a point of reference for the present without giving you a date for when the present is, so that way if the book was being read many years in the future, after it was published and all the things, it could potentially be present for the reader, not present for when I was writing it. Don't know if that makes sense, but that was my thought process. So the feedback that I initially got was that that was really confusing and people really hated it. And it was suggested that instead of using years before present, I use fixed dates. So instead of saying, say, 10,000 years before present, I use 8,000 BC, or 1950 AD, 1 AD, 12,000 BC, etc. So I made all of those changes. I was grumpy about it, but I did it because the timestamps were there only for clarification, so if it wasn't clear, obviously that needed to be fixed. So I made all those changes, gave pages back to people. Negative feedback! Everybody hated the dates so much. Everyone found them really confusing. People were complaining about having to turn back and forth and double check. No, get rid of them was the insistence. And some people wanted absolutely no timestamps of any kind whatsoever, which I thought would be really complicated and confusing when the time jumped around a lot. And some people wanted me to instead just say X number of years later. I thought this would be confusing because the story wasn't linear. It wasn't that the time jumps existed, it was that they were going back and forth. So I couldn't just say 5 years later, 20 years later, 1,000 years later. It would have to be 20 years later, 5,000 years earlier, 10 years later, another 50 years later, 100 years earlier, and I thought that would still cause the same problem. So I had to figure out how I was going to deal with the confusion of the time jumps. I have a solution. I'm going to get rid of them entirely, which means completely rewriting the story to keep to a completely linear format, which means that I can't have these third person sort of chapters that show you the consequences, perhaps far-reaching, of the characters' decisions. So extra books. In order to address this issue of inconsistent jumping around not being easily understood, and in order to address the issues of an ignorant narrator, I have had to go from 1 to 3 books to possibly 9. And that's why I'm still working on this story. My first writing group eventually broke apart because we had met at university. People started graduating and moving away and losing touch. Some of the younger members just kind of grew and changed a little bit. One person turned out to be a creepy stalker who had to be punished. So the group stopped meeting and I found myself alone for a writing community, and that's when I discovered AuthorTube and also actually the writing community on Tumblr, which I have forgot my login for, so don't try and find me there. But through this online writing community, I obviously saw the voices of people who were far different from myself and from my original writing group, and I made a realization. I realized that the story I had created was inherently ableist. It wasn't my intention, but that is what I had created. And having realised that, I wasn't okay with it. So I completely pulled apart my world building and revisited the decisions that I had made about what my vampires were and how they worked and what they were like. And I built in changes to that world building to ensure that I could have a greater diversity in my vampires. So I now have vampires who are differently abled. When I did eventually get a new writing group and I presented them with a chapter where there is a vampire who is hard of hearing, they loved it. So that work has been done. I can kind of tick that off as an achievement. It's had a really good response, so that's great. Did create another book in the series though. I'm sorry if the lighting is now different. The sun has set. Obviously time has passed. We're just moving on. So, where am I up to in my story? I found myself a new writing group. This time it wasn't such an insulated group of people pursuing higher education, people who had all taken the same writing course. This time it was a writing group that had met through the Meetup app. So some people had more education than others, some people had no writing training of any kind, some had like master's degrees in creative writing, and there were several people in the in-between. When it came to the writing courses that the people in this group had done, there were a couple of different courses, but my understanding from talking to people was that what all of these courses had in common was that they had a strong emphasis on story structure as opposed to like beauty of language. So they were quite obviously different from the writing courses that I had taken, in which all the people in my first creative writing group had taken. And what I very quickly noticed was that this new writing group gave very different types of feedback than my first writing group, which was really interesting, and I think kind of highlights the importance of getting critique partners with a range of backgrounds, because of course your readers have a range of backgrounds. So it was interesting to get those extra voices and extra opinions from people who had learned to look for different things and who had different expectations. And I do think this is important, who were not familiar with my background. So my first creative writing group had seen me progress for quite a while and they were familiar with my published work. My new creative writing group didn't even know I was published. So I think there was a slight difference there in that my first creative writing group had sort of a greater faith in me as a writer, whereas my second creative writing group were kind of waiting for me to prove myself still. And I do think that came up a little bit in terms of the nature of some of my critiques. But we're going to move on to the sort of the big recurring important critiques that kept coming up and which I'm trying to address or think about or incorporate into this new stage of planning. So the first issue that I had with this new creative writing group was that they were misgendering non-binary character, the non-binary character. I had to have a bit of a think about why that was. What was happening was that they had, all of them had gone through, crossed out my them, they pronouns and replaced it with a gendered pronoun based on the fact that the character has a gendered name. Now they have a gendered name because they haven't gotten so far through their journey as to have changed it. They actually really like their name, and some non-binary people do. Like, you don't have to change your name just because it's gendered and you personally are not. I could completely address this issue by just giving my character a non-gendered name. I don't want to, but that would be the quick fix. The next issue that came up, and this is kind of related, was that they seemed confused about lesbians. So what had happened was I brought them a scene in which you first meet woman A, and then later you meet in the same scene, but separate and not interacting with the first woman, you meet woman B, who is referred to as the partner of woman A. To me, that seemed sufficient to tell you that this was not a married, but a lesbian couple. This is like 100,000 years ago, so there is no marriage. The problem that I had was that the critique partners kind of got to the second woman, saw the statement of her relationship, the first woman, who was referred to by name for clarity, and then all the comments were like, hang on, I thought this person was a woman, is it not? So I think this kind of default heteronormative thinking was A, heteronormative thinking, but B, I think I accidentally created it because these characters are living 100,000 years ago. They don't have the same names that we have now, and so their names weren't telling you their gender. They were just kind of, you know, keyboard mash names that I had made up. So without the name suggesting gender, they were forgetting or choosing to become confused about the fact that I had said both these people were women, and were thinking maybe I had made a mistake. I think with both this case and the case with the non-binary character, I could fix it by choosing my names more carefully, either by choosing very clearly gendered names or very not very gendered, or not particularly gendered names to clarify. But I'm also hoping that just continuing to have multiple scenes where these characters reappear, living their lives and using their pronouns, that hopefully most readers will kind of get with the game, as it were. But that is something that I need to be aware of, I think, and something that I just want to keep in the back of my mind when I'm choosing character names, and making sure that I give ample opportunity for LGBT plus characters to be seen as who they are, so that hopefully this heteronormative cis thinking, stupid neighbour, thinking can kind of be diluted out over successive scenes. I'm hoping that that's how I can fix that. As with my first critique group, my second critique group also found werewolves where there were none. Now, what really surprised me about this was that this wasn't a scene where I was trying to introduce this original monster and trying to communicate what it is as opposed to a werewolf. This was a completely different opportunity to find a werewolf where there wasn't one. In this scene, I had a character come across a group of people who have been slaughtered, and there is some brief description of sort of the battle that has taken place and the type of injuries that people have. And whilst still sort of processing the shock of having come across this, the character notices that some hyenas are coming, and because of the location, this character is quite vulnerable. And they have to quickly decide if they are going to just run and hope that the hyenas take the easy meal of the already dead people lying around, or are they going to stand their ground and try and protect the dead bodies so that they can be properly buried. When I got feedback on this scene, everyone started talking about the werewolf attack and asking for more details about the werewolves, and I was just like, the what? There are no werewolves? So obviously some of that was just I had not described the types of injuries properly to make sure that people wouldn't imagine werewolves. I honestly didn't think this would be a problem, but I think it kind of reinforces this issue that I'm probably going to continue having, and I imagine other people who write vampire stories are going to have, where people really expect there to be werewolves in a vampire story. We're just going to have to accept that this is our fate and try and write our way out of it. And I think it kind of probably demonstrates the importance of getting feedback on this kind of story, because there's no way I would have picked that up as a potential problem without feedback. Another thing that happened with this scene is that when I was describing the threat of the approaching hyenas, I had originally written a paragraph of 3 to 4 sentences where I had used the word hyena 3 times, and obviously that was like a very echoey, annoying thing, so I switched out hyena for beast in one sentence. So I had hyena, beast, hyena. One of the critique partners had written in, when they gave me feedback, they had written in the deformed. So it read hyena, the deformed beast, hyena. And I was like, I mean, I know hyenas aren't like super pretty, but they're not deformed. And yeah, we started talking about it, and yeah, even though I had said hyena twice, they still believed that the approaching threat was werewolves. So there really does appear to be this almost kind of conscious determination to have werewolves in a vampire story. Werewolves have absolutely no place in my story, so this is something that I think I need to be really consciously aware of whenever I'm describing any kind of animal, any kind of bite mark, anything that is not explicitly human or vampire. Anything else has to be very, very clear, because I think readers are going to imagine werewolves even when told hyenas. So that was kind of quite confusing, but I think also very important feedback to have gotten on that scene. The next type of feedback I got is by far the most frustrating or confusing, almost distressing feedback that I got, and I got over and over and over. And it basically simmered down to my critique partners focusing on the wrong elements of a scene. So I was getting 2 different types of feedback from them doing this. The first was them asking for additional description or information about things which didn't actually matter. So for example, I had a scene where 2 characters are discussing the current political climate. So this scene provided information on obviously the political climate and the political structure in that area. It showed glimpses of the characters' conflicting personalities. One is sort of imagine like a slightly well-to-do Parisian gentleman, the other is a slightly rough around the edges drifter from a fictional location. It showed that they had a common history, that they were multilingual. It showed that there had been a war and the roles that they might have had in it. It gave an indication of how old they were, and it also had a little tiny crumb of detail that was not relevant to the plot of this story, but did feed into the plot of like the overarching series. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that one scene. And when I got feedback from it, everyone started chatting about the scene with the bone and wanting more information about the bone. And I actually had to ask them what bone. I was that bewildered by this feedback. And I flicked through and there was a scene, well not a scene, sorry, a sentence where I had mentioned a bone, but it was so unimportant that I had even forgotten that I had done it. And what it was these 2 characters, when they first meet up, basically just say, "How's it going?" And one of them comments that his girlfriend's really tired and overworked because the museum has a bone fragment that's really interesting and her superiors are giving her more work. Basically, it wasn't important, but my critique group perceived it as the entire point not only of this scene but of the book. They thought that this was the subject of the novel. Very distressing and confusing. The other thing that was happening when they were focusing on incorrect elements of a scene was that they would identify a sentence or maybe even an entire chapter as being pointless, and very, very strongly advise that I delete it. So, just for another example, oh, my earrings are noisy. I had a scene at a pub. This was the first time the pub had appeared in the story, and it is a very important setting, so it was introducing that. It was also the first time a very important character was introduced into the story. We got to see the continuing development and deepening of the relationship between two important characters, and we were introduced to a minor antagonist. We also got to see a few little things about the history of the country, the political climate, and a bit of the kind of culture and traditional religious practices of this fictional nation. We also got to see a conflict between two characters and some slightly interesting carry-on between them, where a stranger shows up and then another character clearly actually knows them and has been discussing that character with them, and there's a little bit of a standoff moment. So I thought the scene had a lot of tensions in it, and then it finishes off with the first use of magic within the story. The feedback I got for this scene was first that it was really interesting and really entertaining and enjoyable, and they loved the interactions between the characters, but absolutely nothing happened. It needed to be deleted. I got these sort of confusing types of feedback on quite a few scenes. This, focus on the irrelevant or dismissal of the very relevant kept happening, and it really started to weigh me down a lot because I just didn't know what I was doing wrong. And so in this process of planning and reworking things, I've had to go back over each of these scenes and try to figure out what is happening or not happening that I'm getting this kind of feedback. Now, I think obviously the immediate solution is to rewrite these scenes to do something to kind of draw the reader's attention in the correct direction, but I think there are a few things that I need to consider when I'm doing that and when I'm planning the reworking of these scenes, or maybe other scenes that introduce the same information in a way that works better. And I think this is that the scenes where I was getting this kind of feedback were all the scenes which fed into the more mystery plot. I never got these kinds of critiques on the scenes which related to the little bit of a romance plot, which I think is interesting. Like, maybe my mystery plot was too mysterious. Maybe. I also think it's interesting that the only people who were giving me these types of critiques were the ones who had taken creative writing classes which had a really strong emphasis on structure. And I wonder if what was happening was that instead of just enjoying the story, they were reading with a very active mind to tick off like a list of things that a scene must have, and were searching for story beats and that kind of thing, which is fine, except that this group only met every second week, and I was only bringing a maximum of 5 pages at a time. So if a chapter was, say, 20 pages, it would take them 2 months to read it. And I'm wondering if they were feeling that nothing happened in a scene because it was just broken up over too long a reading period, and they were forgetting what had previously happened by the time they got to this bit, so their assessment of the whole scene was that nothing had happened at all. Now, those aren't necessarily true things, like maybe that's not what was happening. Maybe I do in fact just need to rewrite because I'm kind of shit at drawing the reader's attention to the right things, but I do think that that's an important consideration. And so what I think I need to do is to give these scenes intact to one person, to have them read the whole thing in one hit, to see if they can identify the important parts, or if they are also going to pick up on the wrong things, if it's read in its entirety instead of in little installments. So that's something that I'm going to have to work into my plan as well. The next type of common feedback that I was getting that I'm going to have to keep in mind with the replanning is kind of similar to the werewolf thing where people kept finding werewolves. My readers were my critique partners were always finding sexual tension and vampires in scenes where there were none. So I would have a scene where I would describe a human and everyone would assume they were a vampire. And I think in some cases that's going to be a really difficult fix. In others, I don't know how to fix it at all. There's a few difficulties there. So I have a character who is human but has a chronic illness. This is a illness that does exist in the human population where you get blistering on your skin and intense headaches, etc. when you're exposed to sunlight. So it's often referred to as the sunlight allergy. So I can see why people saw a character who has that sickness or condition, I should say, and so isn't going out in daylight. I can see why they would jump to the conclusion that that character's a vampire. So obviously I need to work in additional kind of information or markers into the description of that character to make sure that she is identified as a human. I thought I had done this, but again, obviously I'm going to have to ramp it up, keeping in mind that I think readers are searching for the vampires. Kind of similarly, I had a character that is human and I wrote what I thought was quite a detailed description, and then everyone thought they were a vampire. I had described this person as an elder. I said they were holding their granddaughter with withered hands. I described sagging breasts, deep wrinkles and pale hair. Now apparently, because I used the word pale instead of grey, just that word pale was enough to make my critique partners assume she was blonde and therefore European, therefore a vampire, and therefore an aristocrat. And so the critiques I got were asking me why I had an aristocratic European vampire in Africa 100,000 years ago. So, you know, prior to the aristocracy or the migration of humans out of Africa or white people in general. So again, I think what's happening is that I'm having to remember with this planning that I'm going to have to be very, very specific about my descriptions. Anything that can be interpreted as a vampire will become a vampire, even if it's coupled with numerous non-vampire indicators, which is a very frustrating thing, but it was a recurring problem. So it's not something that I necessarily have an easy solution for, but it's something that I'm going to have to work into the plan and make sure that my plan for writing it includes really specific descriptions. I also had issues with people finding sexual tension, which again I think is because people are searching for vampires. Vampires are generally, but aren't universally, but are generally associated with sexual liberation. So they're thinking, okay, a vampire story, we're looking for the sexual relationships. And so I have characters which have 100% platonic relationship, but I'm getting a lot of questions about the sexual tension between them, even though I don't perceive there to be any sexual tension. For example, I had a conversation between two men within a hunter-gatherer society where they discuss weather patterns and the movement of the local herd, because that seems like something that would be important to you if you were living off the land. My critique partners were asking why man A was spouting poetry to man B. Did he want to have sex with him? Now, I do write poetry. Maybe I went a bit too poetic. I don't know. But I also had a scene where I had a mentor lightly teasing his student about being awkward around the attractive woman over there. this was interpreted as the mentor expressing jealousy over the attractive woman because he wanted to have sex with the student, and the assumption was that I was describing the beginning of a love triangle, which I definitely wasn't. So again, yes, this is okay. I need to think about making sure I'm very clear about the nature of people's relationships and sexual orientation when I'm describing things. There is one thought there that in trying to incorporate some gentle platonic teasing, I've crossed a line into less than platonic teasing, which just could be the fact that I'm actually just a little bit of a flirt and I went too far. However, I do think it's interesting that this misidentification of the nature of people's relationships kept coming through from one person who may have been, seeking out sexual relationships because of genre-informed assumptions about the story. But I do think this is relevant, maybe. This was also a writer who creates erotica. So maybe they were reading my story through a porno lens. At any rate, I do think it's worth just sort of generally making a note to myself with the description of my platonic relationships. I need to maybe just double check that any light teasing isn't accidentally flirtatious. My last piece of challenging critique that I need to keep in mind and try and address in my plan for this story is a question around my accuracy in describing early humans. So one of these storylines that I'm working on starts 100,000 years ago. So we're talking prior to the migration of humans out of Africa. We are talking a time when there are multiple hominid species existing in one area. What I found in my feedback was that my descriptions of early humans was being brought under question wherever it differed from what was described in Clan of the Cave Bear. Now, Clan of the Cave Bear has Neanderthals and it has Homo sapiens, and it does have a blurb in the front that explicitly states that it was super well researched and that the author was held in high regard by experts because of their work. It also tells you that the book was first written in 1980, so we are talking 40 years out of date at this point. Our knowledge of early humans has come a really long way since then. We've developed DNA technologies. Things which were being speculated in the 80s are now proven or disproven. We have found many more sites. Our understanding of the technological advancement of Neanderthal has changed. We're in a very different place in terms of our understanding of early humans now than we were 40 years ago. So when I wrote these scenes, I was basing it on current research. Whenever I had a question about how I should describe something, being a scientist, I went to scientific literature and pulled up recent peer-reviewed journal articles on those subjects. So to then have the accuracy of my descriptions being pulled into question because somebody once read a novel that's 40 years old was not something I expected. To be honest, I don't have any idea how I'm going to fix this problem. It's something that I'm going to have to put into the plan. I'm going to have to come up with some solution for how I'm going to convince my reader that my current and up-to-date accurate descriptions of things is accurate, even though it's different from a 40-year-old novel. I don't know how I'm going to do that. If you have any suggestions, oh my god, put them in the comments, help me. And I think it was a recurring critique because it's obviously something that really bothered people, and it is a critique I got from multiple people in various ways. So I need to make a plan for how I'm going to address that issue. I really don't want to write blatantly incorrect descriptions just to keep in line with somebody else's novel from 40 years ago. I want actual, accurate, up-to-date descriptions. I don't expect my descriptions to remain up-to-date for long, but at least I want to do my best in terms of accuracy. So how I get accuracy without pissing off people who have read Clan of the Cave Bear, I don't have a plan for that. But I need to make one. So those are all the recurring critiques or challenging critiques that I had for my vampire story, both the original book one and the new book one. And I think these are things which are pretty significant problems that I need to have a really solid plan for addressing before I start working on it again. So they are things that I want to build into this plan that I'm reworking through as I'm progressing beyond the mind maps I'm currently building and starting to go from just general chaos of ideas and into actual stated like story beats and scenes. So that's where I'm up to. I honestly don't think I'm going to be able to get through this in time for NaNoWriMo. That had kind of been the dream, was that I would get all of this done and I'd have this robust, amazing plan, and I could go back to my vampire story in November. Starting to have some doubts. If you've enjoyed this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you're new around here, maybe consider hitting subscribe and ringing that bell so you can stay up to date, and I'll see you next time. Bye!